Bonjour à tous et à toutes.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a great pleasure to be here today for this session. I don't know quite how much you all know about the Pact. I've tried to be quite sort of educational and give you an overview, not going too much into the details. I wanted to really tell you where this pact comes from, the philosophies behind it, some of the dangers it represents for the rights of people in exile. And I wanted to also just go back also over the various alternatives that we can go into and the orientations, the directions that we can look to go into. So some of the ways that we can find alternatives. During this session, we're going to therefore look at the Pact as an ambitious project. It's a negative project, but an ambitious one nonetheless. Thousands of pages. I'm sorry if there are certain aspects that I'm not going to go into. I'm trying to really go to what's essential and look at the elements that are the most important for us. In French-speaking Belgium, here we've looked at what we feel are the salient points. So we're part of the civil society in France. We try to represent this body of organizations at the CNCD. So this is what I'm planning to do today. I'm going to go over a brief history of the origins of the pact, why it was set up, why the negotiations started 3 years ago in 2020. They've only recently come to their conclusion. What are some of the orientations and contents of this pact, the consequences, as I was saying, for the fundamental human rights of exiles, and some of the alternatives to the pact, so the ones that we feel are most pertinent in terms of international migration and the various different sides of this: international mobility, reception, and other details like crossing the border. I hope we'll have a lot of time also for questions and answers. I'm going to try to make sure that we do have time. So, with regard to the history, then, as I said, the negotiations around the pact started in 2020. But this pact didn't just come out of nothing. On a European level, we had what we called the EU fortress concept that was being set up little by little with certain instruments and tools that were being set up. And these are more and more repressive. They were more and more designed to actually prevent international mobility and prevent countries from receiving migrants, at least for some anyway. And we saw how things were coming into EU legislation over the past 30 years, we could say. Some say so since the 1990s, or the fortress, the EU fortress, has been being built. We have the famous Schengen area, freedom of movement, that was set up in 1995 to protect free movement within the European area, with a lot less strict controls at the borders. And the 27 states of the EU talked about really reinforcing the external borders of this space. So this meant that little by little, this fortress Europe was being set up based on excessive controls. And some of these, this at the European borders, went against human rights and international law. So we've got a series of tools that came in, like the Dublin regulation. We had the second version coming in, the way in which people were being received in Europe was being managed. We talked about how it was the first country in which people set foot that was going to be very important in terms of how people's files were being followed up on when they were demanding international protection. In 2004, we had the setting up of the famous Frontex agency that was there to control the external borders of Europe. It started with a very small budget, but now it has an exponential budget and its own autonomy and roles that has been given without democratic control. In 2005, we had the notion of migration and development. So we looked at how these two concepts were linked and the respect for the Geneva Convention, but also the fact that there was this idea of linking migration to development and the fact that individuals should stay in their own countries if their fundamental rights were being respected and if the conditions were thought to be okay. I'm not going to go into detail with regard to this, but there was a presupposition linked to this idea that their human rights and their fundamental rights would always be respected in certain countries. The idea was to discourage international mobility and thinking about this, we have to question, I think, some of these concepts and the overall approach when it comes to limiting mobility. Little by little, this came to be linked also to individuals who really needed international protection, and this first country element was very important. In 2008, we had the EU Return Directive. We had also the Visa Entry Code in 2009. So a selection process in terms of the criteria allowing individuals to enter the EU. We had this idea of sorting as well that came in during this kind of time, 2008, 2009, and the collecting of data on individuals. So the biometrics, registering people's data, and Eurodac came into being. So the idea of actually making sure we had files and data on individuals. And then in 2014, another important date is when Italy was looking at the organization of Mare Nostrum. So it's a link to search and rescue in the Mediterranean, and the fact that accessibility was being really undermined, and Italy was looking at what was happening when it came to the routes taken by migrants, which were becoming illegal. This operation, funded by Italy from 2014 onwards, became an operation that was taken up by Frontex, and it was no longer a rescue operation but a control operation. And this is still very much the case today. We're talking about control, sorting, stopping international migration, and also this idea of pushbacks and actually people being endangered by this. So we can look at how this evolved and how it's now impossible for individuals to actually take some of these routes by themselves. There are now this issue between the issue of countries being able to actually organize things themselves, and then this overall agency Frontex being responsible for this. We looked at how these controls became stronger and stronger from 2015 onwards. We're going to go into this in more detail and look at how countries had some disagreements around this. We also can look at 2015 onwards as an important date in terms of the crisis, in terms of receiving migrants in the EU. We had important and high flow of people demanding international protection from Syria, and this really made the situation quite acute, and a series of tools were developed tools that the pact then went on to confirm around 10 years later. So, what were some of these tools? Well, when these individuals arrived, there was an issue to do with externalization. So, the hot spot approach, the idea of closing borders, and also criminalization, which is linked to encampment as well. These are four very important aspects linked to the pact. And since this time onwards, 2015-ish, the negative aspects of these were really very evident. So even back then, we saw that there was some real fallacious concepts being held up as important, and things were really not working, and this became very clear as the years went on. We'll talk about outsourcing in greater detail, externalization, the idea of not allowing individuals to enter EU territory and asking the countries of origin, the so-called southern countries, to actually make sure that uh, there was a return policy being really underlined. There was various links to um, development assistance and various different tools that were being brought in to try to really encourage these countries of origin to kind of play the role of Europe in controlling their own citizens. This became really important from 2015 onwards in European strategy, and we'll see that it's a central element of what's happening today around the pact. In 2015, there was also what we called the hotspot approach. So this approach was that we felt that once people came into European territory, they were considered as being in a kind of waiting zone, a transit zone, or a fictitious non-entry zone. So they weren't really considered to be in the EU in a legal sense. So if they were in Italy or in Greece, for example, they would be sorted. They would be prioritized or not. And we saw as part of this approach the idea of racism behind European migratory policy. The fact that we weren't treating people in the same way, depending on their country of origin, their culture, and the color of their skin. So, in this hotspot approach, there was a discouragement and the fact that there was a presupposition as well that other European states would be able to relocalize individuals that were in limbo in Italy, particularly those asking for international protection. This approach didn't work because the majority of the 27 countries of the EU didn't actually come to the aid of these hotspot countries. There was just a small percentage of individuals. We can talk about 37,000 individuals who were actually relocalized in the EU, and therefore this hotspot system really didn't work, and it was discriminatory also, because we'll see how people based on their country of origin didn't actually have the same rights and didn't go through the same procedures. This hotspot approach therefore meant that individuals became in a situation of limbo in the countries they arrived in, and there were camps set up. There were camps that were growing and became really out of control, with sanitary conditions that were really shocking, with a lack of legal support and inhumane conditions for individuals who were living there. The time that people had to spend there was very long, even those who were asking for international protection. And so this became a real issue. And there was a an important incident with a fire in the Moria camp in Greece that really hit the headlines because individuals were killed, and it became really the shame of Europe, the shame linked to the conditions in which people in exile were being received in Europe. So this pact was thought to be a response to this. And it went through the EU Commission, etc., with individuals saying, we're not going to have this happen again. The pact is going to find solutions to this situation. Looking at the closing of borders, if we look at 2016 onwards with Frontex and the fact that its budget increased, the issue was that things were going to become more and more controlled by Frontex and others, and the pushback concept really came in, which was a violation of international human rights. So we saw these camps and we saw a criminalization as well of people who were now thought to be individuals who had come in an illegal sense, and also anybody who was helping them as well. So the issue was that even individuals asking for international protection were now being looked at as individuals who'd been involved in criminal activities. So those who had helped steer boats, for example, en route, were then called into question and actually looked at as real perpetrators of crimes. And it was a real dominant current of thought, this idea that people had to be brought to court and tried in this criminalization aspect of things. We have to look at the response also of the United Nations, because we have the Global Compact on migration, and this is something that we can really emphasize as a possible model, although the civil society actually criticizes this a lot. The vocabulary and the language used and the orientation of this is also a lot more positive than some of the solutions that the European Union brought in around about 2015, because we talk about the reception of individuals, the sharing of this responsibility, a more positive vision of international mobility and migrants. And so we need to perhaps make reference to this. And for us, I think this UN Global Compact needs to be also put in context, because the situation was so acute from 2016 to 2018. This can be thought of as a kind of compass to guide us, I think, with a more positive perspective when it comes to mobility and exiled individuals. We feel that actually the EU Pact is linked to the compact in a certain sense, but I think there are elements that haven't been taken up. So after the Moria camp fire, with the member states of the EU saying this cannot happen again, we need to reform our migration policy, we need to all get around the table, and we need to find solutions. Urgent solutions and also lasting solutions. In 2015, most of the tools that had been put on the table were presented as tools that were for emergency use. So they were things that were very much a short-term response. And now in 2020, the idea was to actually look to the long term and find lasting solutions that would be win-win for all those involved. So the people on the front lines, the people that were in exile, but also the member states themselves and the local communities. Now, when we look back at the situation and what's happened since, we can say that things have got worse, that situations are even more dire. We've got to remember that in 2022, we also had this activation of temporary protection from the EU for Ukrainian nationals. So after the start of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, I think it's very important to mention this, because this was something that enabled individuals to cross the border in a much more fluid way without being excessively controlled and they were able to actually come into the EU and receive protection, at least for a year. And then there was a real effort to integrate and to welcome these individuals who had fled war. So it's important to see what happened when it came to actually giving these individuals shelter, and this had never been activated in the past. It hadn't been activated linked to the conflicts in Syria or Sudan, but it was activated in 2022 for the Ukrainian situation. Why do I bring this up? It's to show that solutions are possible, that it's possible to receive individuals when there is this kind of crisis, when there's a big flow of refugees coming in after a conflict, an armed conflict in a certain country, and it's possible to activate this temporary protection, but it hasn't been done up to that point. It's important to see also how we can perhaps analyze this and say that, well, certain individuals were able to be actually welcomed in this way, and there's a whole issue of looking at their background. In 2023, there was a political agreement on the 5 components of the EU Pact. It took 3 years for individuals to actually agree, all the different member states and all the different representatives, in terms of the 5 components. So in terms of managing the borders, we saw how then it took 3 years, but there was a political agreement, and this actually also comprised the reception component. If we look at this particular agreement, then I think it's also very important to look at how it was actually rolled out and what happened in terms of the way the discussions ensued. We can see now that we're in a situation where we're coming to the end of what we call the trialogue, and we have a proposal that came in from the Commission, and there were various different elements that were also examined by the Council with their own proposal. The 3 entities of the EU, the Parliament, the Council and the Commission, have to be in agreement on a common text in order for us to be able to say that a European Pact has been adopted. So this is the case now. We have this agreement. The Parliament has adopted the text, and the European Council is going to adopt it in the coming weeks, despite enormous pressure from the civil society and despite everything we've done in terms of mobilization, in terms of also our advocacy work, etc. Many of the most problematic elements are still in the pipeline to be adopted, and the idea is that it's going to be rolled out from 2016. So this is a bit of background between the history. So in 2020, it was presented in this way. I've got quotations here, and I'm going to read them because I feel that it's really important in terms of the spirit in which the pact was actually rolled out. So in 2020, when the pact was presented, within the European Commission, we said the current system no longer works. Over the last 5 years, the EU has been unable to fix it. So the individuals continue to see how violence increases on routes. The EU has been unable to fix the system. The EU must overcome the current stalemate and rise to the task. So we have to see how, by presenting the new pact on migration and asylum, the EU Commission is proposing common European solutions to a European challenge. The EU must move away from ad hoc solutions, as I was saying, emergency solutions, and put in place a predictable and reliable managed migration management system. So this was the way in which the pact was presented to the Commission, and the ambition was to actually move from emergency to long-lasting, future-focused work. We also have a quotation here from Margarita Chinas, the Greek Vice President of the European Commission and the Commissioner responsible for promoting our European way of life. So the pact was described as we have built a three-tier structure. I won't go into that too much, but the idea was that the pact was presented here as this three-floored house, if you like. So an external dimension, outsourcing and agreements with the countries of origin and transit, obliging them to cooperate more closely and to promote their nationals on their territory. So this is outsourcing, externalization. Secondly, we have the introduction of effective controls at the borders, and so that Frontex was strengthened. And thirdly, a permanent and effective solidarity mechanism. So here in these two quotations, we can see that what's being proposed, particularly in the second one, has nothing new in terms of what had been done the 20 years before, but it's being presented as something new.
What are the three dimensions of the EU Pact? We've got three dimensions. On the 10th of April, Parliament adopted other texts that are directly linked to the Pact, but they are not part of the legislation of the Pact. The Pact is based on 5 legal texts and recommendations. Within those 5 texts, there are 3 dimensions. I'm going to repeat myself, but the first dimension is a stronger external dimension. In all the texts, we have that obsession with the return. We say that Frontex will be deployed beyond European borders. They will sign agreements with Mauritania, with Senegal soon, and there will be creation of posts of EU return coordinators on the national level. Member states are encouraged to sign agreements of readmissions, and they are told that there is no problem. They can use the blackmail for visas. And also the Commission encourages the reception in the closest countries, because they are called safe third countries. So the criteria are not very clear. They are not detailed. So we don't really know what they mean by safe third country. But what we know for sure is that Tunisia, Morocco, or Bangladesh are not safe third countries. Most of people who would ask for international protection can be sure that their rights are respected. So this is the dimension that is in the proposition of the EU Pact. We need to add also that unlike the UN Pact, most of the proposals are not discussed with those safe third countries. They are not around the table. They don't have a word to say. They are imposed that role of safe countries, and we assume that they agree to play that role because they will be seduced and they will be given different incentives. For example, a visa quota that they will be able to use. And we know that those visas will go for people who are privileged, and it's not for those who are the most in need to be able to travel. A stronger external dimension is the first step. The second dimension that is in the pact is the tighter border controls. From now on, so from 2026, people who arrive on the European borders, no matter their motivation, their profile, their background, and their journey, no matter their age, gender, they will put almost systematically into detention for 12 weeks. Once they will be detained, children will be detained also. There will be a screening system that will be compulsory. We will study, analyze everything, how healthy they are. They will look at the security concerns. They will have their fingerprints taken, and they will be sorted. So this screening will take place within 5 days for most of people, but detention be able to will go up to 12 weeks, because once the sorting is done and the screening is done, people will be sorted depending on the results obtained through the screening, and then they will be redirected into three directions. The first one will be a procedure of asylum, an express procedures for those who are in need of protection, for those who would come from a country that is recognized. So if originating from a country with a low recognition rate of protection is minus 20%. So if they are very unlikely to get protection, we won't waste time, and they will be given an accelerated procedure. So it's going to be something that will be done very quickly, and most of the time they will have a negative outcome. So they will use the screening to determine where they're from. If they are from a country where the protection rate is less than 20%, they will be automatically directed to the other express procedure. Another route that can be taken is the ordinary asylum seeker procedure. It is the one that is taking a little bit of more time and enables people to have interpreters, translators, and legal advice. It is the ordinary protection. It is something that is being put in place for many years. The third option, the third route, depending on the screening, is the expulsion. If a person is not asking for protection, just say that the person left his or her country because they didn't live in decent conditions. They're not asking for protection, but they just want to come to Europe to meet the family or find a job. If the person is not asking for protection, if the person is not coming from a country where the protection rate is above 20%, then they will consider that this person is not eligible and will be directly sent to the expulsion route. All these options will be studied while the person is in detention for 12 weeks. So where are those detention centers? They will be in the entrance countries: Cyprus, Malta, Spain, Italy, and Greece. So these countries that say that they were a bit, felt on their own dealing with all the problems and were the hotspot countries are once again the countries that will have to deal with everything with the arrival of people in Europe. And it is not the system that will help these frontline countries to deal with the situation. So people will be in camps and they will stay more than 12 weeks in these countries in detention centers where they will have no more freedom, because even if you are redirected in the expulsion route, you still have to wait for your origin country or your transit country accept to take you back. And we know that most of the countries from the south don't want to sign those agreements of readmission. So these people will just stay detained in the centers, overcrowded centers in those entry countries. So the new element also is that families with children under 12 will be detained, and even minors who could represent a threat for European countries. So this is the new system that is being suggested for the control and crossing the border. What is important, and we've seen that with the hotspot, is that these people who will be detained, screened, and sorted and reoriented, despite the fact that they are already on the European continent and in a European state, they will be in a system of non-entry. They won't be they won't access the fundamental rights of people who ask for asylum. These people will be like in a waiting room, a waiting area, and we can see that we will try to do externalization within the same European border. You are in Europe, but we will consider that you're not there yet because you're going to be in a waiting room outside of the European rights. So it is opposite. It is completely not acceptable given the European international rights. If we look at the third dimension of the pact, is the reception, which is not a flexible solidarity mechanism. This system has been called flexible solidarity mechanism, but it is compulsory and it enables the member states to choose their type of reception that they want to apply. Member states can look at the first entry countries and they can look at the different profiles, for example, Belgian, and they're going to say, we're going to look at this application and we can use that reception mechanism. Some member states will decide that they don't want to welcome people because they say that we're not going to take anyone, for example, Hungary or Slovakia, and they will have the possibility to be to show solidarity in the return, which means they will be able to fund and finance places for the return. So they're going to pay for their non-solidarity. And they will be able to give funds for strengthening the externalization, for example, supporting the training of police forces and reception centers in non-EU countries. So you can see that the solidarity system that is promoted in the pact is a system that is not a real solidarity system. It's something that is à la carte, which means it is flexible solidarity, where people can choose what they want to do. And they want to encourage return. The Dublin regulation that was not working, we've seen that in 2015. Most of the countries said that they need to be reformed, that it should not be the first country of entry that should be in charge of granted protection. But in the pact, the Dublin regulation has not been reformed. It stays and it remains the same. It means the first country of entry will be responsible for studying and assessing the application. So these are the three dimensions of the pact. They will be expensive because when you create reception centers for the entry countries, it represents quite a lot of money. So this pact is not bringing anything new. It is expensive and it doesn't bring sustainable solutions because the entry countries will remain the same and remain the only one to deal with the applications. And there is a non-respect of the asylum rights and international protection and the rights of the children. On this slide, you have all the tools that organize the pact, and I've just told you about the different dimensions. Here you've got the list. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because we are running out of time, but you can see that there are 5 legislative proposals of reforms. There is a screening, APR, RAM, the crisis, and one that is for Eurodac, which is registering and exchanging data on people who have entered the European territories. There are also 3 recommendations, but they are not legally binding. And there are proposals of guidelines in terms of legal routes and integration, but they are not legally binding either. They are just suggestions that are made to the member states. The 5 legislative aspects are binding and constraining. So this is why for the civil society, the pact is not offering anything new, and it is offering the same wrong solutions, but it's even worse than the situation that we knew previously, because it will make legal what the member states were doing illegally before, which is pushback. We know that Greece is pushing back and sending people back, and we know that with this pact and this sorting system on the borders and reorientation of countries depending on their country will just legalize countries that were illegal before. And this is why it's dangerous, because how do you want to do recourse and legal actions if what you are challenging is legal in terms of European legislation? So now, what are the consequences for the rights of displaced people? So there is vulnerability. So once people are in the borders with the screening and the sorting, you won't be able within 5 days to give the necessary attention to study properly the application of a person, and in a respectful way, with quality and time that they would deserve, and the expertise that would be required. I'm thinking of women who have experienced violence during their journey or in their countries. If the conditions are not here for them to testify and talk about what they went through, of course, there is vulnerability that won't be taken into account. And a lot of people who, with a deep analysis of their case, would have gained international protection, won't obtain anything, because everything would be expedited, and they won't get the protection that they deserve. Another problem is that the results of the screening won't be challenged. There is no possible recourse, no appeal following the screening results. So it is said in the pact that there is an independent control system, but this system is not explained. We don't know who's going to put that in place in the member states, or is that at the border only? We know that most of the violence on displaced people and migrants don't happen just on the borders. Usually it happens before they cross the border, especially when they cross at sea on the Balkan route and also in the Sahara. We know that a lot of violence happen at that time with people doing human trafficking, which are very far from European borders. I've said that already. We also have a problem with this pact because there is, it doesn't respect the Geneva Convention of the principle of non-refoulement, and this will be legalized with the screening and sorting system. We will now have a systematic detention. Most of the countries committed to alternative solutions to detention, and a lot of countries decided to use the detention only in the last recourse, but it's not going to be the case anymore. We always say that you have to detain in the last recourse, but here it's going to be different. It will be a systematic detention as soon as they arrive. And it will be the same for children. So children's right will no longer be a priority and will no longer be respected. We can see that the screening, in the screening process, they will have their fingerprints taken from the age of 16. We don't know why it's been changed from 18 to 16. And we ended up seeing the age lowered, and having kids will have to give their fingerprints and will be registered on the system, Eurodac. Which brings another problem, which is the protection of personal data and how data will be shared between the different European agencies with Europol, Eurodac, and artificial intelligence will be used also. And it will be, some funding will be dedicated to that part. And there will be some negative elements for the future of these people, the link between criminality and migration and terrorism will be blurred, and agencies will exchange personal data of people. Another aspect, to have asylum, to seek asylum, you have to leave your country in a safe route. One possibility is just to use a safe and legal route, but the problem is that those legal and safe rules are completely absent from the pact. There is just one reform of the single permit that is for work permit in Europe, some visas that would be granted from third countries so that people could work in Europe. This system has been reformed, and the pact is talking about that, but it is not mentioning the fact that it would be good to create more legal and safe routes that are, in the end, the solution to the asylum seekers, because once you've got safe and legal routes, then you're not risking your life and you're not using illegal systems to get into Europe, and you don't get in touch with smugglers and human traffickers. So legal and safe routes would be clearly the solution, but nothing is mentioned in that pact to respect the fundamental rights of people who want to migrate. As I said, also, the consequences of the pact will legalize informal practices that were used, like the pushbacks. It will increase violence because there is no safe and legal routes. There will be a strengthening of externalizations, and people will try to find other roads and other routes, and it will increase violence and deaths. We will have a structural crisis in the EU reception sector because the country of first reception will remain the countries at the front line. People will be told, look how you will be welcomed if you go to Europe. The living conditions are appalling and unhealthy. So think twice before traveling and before starting your migration. So it's really a deterrent to try to prevent people from coming. Try to it is clearly part of the deterrent strategy of Europe, and also to legitimate responses that promote repression, saying we cannot manage that crisis and we need to strengthen. So it legitimates the repressive practices that are more and more present. Another consequence will be the increasing of racist and xenophobic mindsets. So people will have the example of people who are migrants and presented to European people as a threat, as abusers of people bringing insecurity. So it will be confirmation of the racist and xenophobic approach. The fact also that they are sorting people confirms the racist approach of the EU migration policies. And I told you about the temporary protection. That was the confirmation that everybody is not treated the same depending on who you are and who goes to the front, to the border, depending on their countries and origins. So this is to show you that the pact is not a solution and is not bringing anything new. It is just communication to say that the 27 are around the table and that the EU was able to suggest solutions to its members to deal with the crisis. But in the fact, it's going to worsen the situation and it will not bring any solution. So if we want to have some time, I'll try to finish on that.
So I'll try to present this as the last slide. So when it comes to what the pact is proposing, we want to look at how we can perhaps present alternatives. So the first one is to reappropriate the definition of solidarity. This has been somehow undermined, and we can look at flexible solidarity as a concept, but this issue, this idea of solidarity, is to really put the necessary resources in place, the financial resources, etc., to really favorize solidarity and not looking at externalization, but looking at coherent measures. So, for example, development cooperation, the idea of not trying to hold back the Mediterranean tide, but to actually support the efforts that are being made to actually look at the sustainable development under the SDGs, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and to make sure that everybody, whether this be in their country of origin or another country they've chosen, is able to live in the conditions they need to actually have a quality of life that is acceptable. As I said before, for us, it's also really important to look at the European Pact in relation to the United Nations Global Compact on migration. Not that the compact is absolutely perfect, but we feel that this can be a compass for us in terms of the way in which we can envisage migration policy. We feel that this compact offers many more positive and constructive ways forward when it comes to the image that we can have on social cohesion and people in exile. We have various recommendations to present here. It's sometimes very much looking to go against what the pact is proposing. So stop this outsourcing of the management of migration issues and set up inclusive and egalitarian North-South partnerships for all countries on an international level, and also, of course, the populations that are in the front lines. It's important to look at how we can examine all the different profiles that might be present during an immigration journey. and look at some effective and independent monitoring that could be set up. We have to allow individuals to be able to actually make complaints, make appeals in an accessible way, to guarantee their rights. We need to also make sure that we look at Frontex. Some agencies want the Frontex agency to be completely eradicated. We feel that we can perhaps underline the need for radical reform of the way this agency Frontex operates, because it's at the moment going against human rights law. We need to also look at how rescue operations can be set up in a more positive way, in allowing everybody to have the same level of mobility and to save lives. We need to reject this sorting and filtering approach, this hotspot approach, which is against human rights, and we need to look at how we can take charge of vulnerabilities for individuals during exile. We need to abolish the flexible solidarity mechanism and introduce a permanent binding mechanism of solidarity in terms of our intra-European reception, and particularly taking into account the voices, the personal situations and aspirations of exiles. So talking to them to find out which countries they are wanting to go to, maybe because they have the linguistic ability to get on well in that country, maybe because they have contacts there. What do they actually envisage? This is really important. I think without we had a report in 2016 from the European Parliament saying that it was really important to hear the voices of exiles when it came to the choice of country. But this wasn't something that was actually brought in. Dublin hasn't been reformed properly. We need to also reject the accelerated asylum procedure based on the principle of safe countries of origin and contribute to upward European harmonisation in terms of the standards and the procedures for obtaining asylum and reception. So we have to make sure that this happens, so that there's a possibility for real positive change here. We also need to invest in real alternatives to detention and only deprive people of their liberty as a last resort. And as the international text stipulates, for a limited period of term, and looking at proportionality as a principle and prohibiting the confinement of children. So that's it from me. I know it was quite dense. I wanted to show that this pact is something that is dramatic, important for us, something that we've been denouncing certain elements for years, and it's something that was presented as something new and a change, and it wasn't at all, it isn't at all. So the civil society is very worried about the results of this, and we're asking now that in terms of what certain member states can do, is there a way of limiting the negative effects of the pact? If we look at everything that is set out in the pact, I think this is really going to undermine the fundamental rights of exiles.